our co-host, Ken Hill, the president of the Union of Concerned Scientists, who you're going to meet in just a moment. We called this session Responsible Science in a Perilous Time. And unfortunately, that phrase doesn't really need a lot of explanation. Most of us in the room recognize the peril in our time, and most of us are in search of responsible ways to steer science for humanity's benefit. We face enormous global challenges, including climate change and nuclear proliferation, and the advance of hugely transformative life science technologies as well, like new forms of assisted reproductive technology and new and powerful ways to do gene modification. Advances in artificial intelligence are blending with all of these other changes, and they're offering great benefits, but also some significant potential harms. To ensure the benefits and mitigate the harms, we need global and local governance. And we need to embrace evidence. We also need to think about ends. What kind of society are we aiming to build with our science and technology? What virtues and values should we preserve? What's going to most promote human flourishing, and what might risk it? And we need, I don't need to say this, we need to listen to one another as we confront deep divisions and differences. And yet, with all those challenges, at the very same time, there's a rising anti-intellectualism, a deep mistrust of expertise, and a body politic that is undermined by very deep polarization. Ken and I became excited by the prospect of holding a joint session to begin a local dialogue on these grave matters, and to share with you some of what our respective organizations are doing, and also to have a conversation about what more could be done by our organizations and others. This afternoon, you're going to hear from 3 scientists at the Union of Concerned Scientists, who are doing work on science policy of various kinds, and from 3 scholars at the Hastings Center. We're going to have brief discussions with 2 speakers at a time, and after every 2 speakers, there'll be 12 to 15 minutes available to ask questions to those people. And then after all 6 presentations, we will have time for what I hope will be a really robust discussion. I'd like to thank Alan Milton on the board of the union, and Robert Cutler, who first introduced me to Alan. Robert introduced me to Alan, and the 2 of them introduced me to Ken. So thank you very much, wherever you're sitting, for your enthusiasm for this. I'd also like to thank the Hastings Center board, our chairman, David Rutherford, who could not be here today, Liza Bailey, who many of you know, and Harriet Rabb, who is here today. And Harriet, if you just raise your hand so people can see you in the break. A little higher. She's sitting there with the green jacket. Now, Ken and I decided we would also use a few minutes to tell each of you a little bit about our respective organizations before the actual program begins. And I know that many people in the room do know about the Hastings Center, but I'm wondering how many of you are fairly new to the center, so I know. Okay. Oh, that's great. So I will take a few minutes just to say a little tiny bit. We were started in 1969, so we were approaching our 50th anniversary in 2019. We are the first research institution in the world to have recognized that advances in science and technology were going to raise important social and ethical questions, and that there ought to be a place where people could gather together to deliberate on these matters. And we're often credited, therefore, with starting the field of bioethics, which is now a very robust field with academic centers and medical schools across the world. Here at the Hastings Center, we articulate foundational values that are at stake so that deeper conversations can occur. We try to recommend how to navigate healthcare policy questions and science policy questions that will render them a respectful and compassionate and just healthcare system, and that will try to ensure the greatest benefits from technology. We have 7 scholars that are mainly located here, that are in residence here, but we also have almost 200 affiliated Hastings Center fellows, mostly around the US, but increasingly globally as well, and we can tap them and many others to do the research work that happens here. We publish 2 journals. Greg Kaednick, whom you'll hear from later, is the editor-in-chief of the Hastings Center Report, which is considered one of the preeminent journals in this field. And Karen Maschke is here. She's the editor-in-chief of IRB, which focuses on the protection of human research subjects. We have a very active visiting scholar program, and that if I was going to use one slide, it was going to be to show you how many young faces are here on this beautiful lawn, and especially in the summer, all year round, but especially in the summer, from all over the world, coming to use the library and to mix it up with our scholars and share and advance their own research. And as you'll see in my more formal remarks later on, we also have a very active public engagement program, and we see ourselves as serving journalists so that their reporting is as informed as it can be. If you want to receive some of the public engagement activities we have, which are a weekly email and an invitation to a bi-monthly conversation by phone, please leave your email address. There's a sheet outside. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Ken Kimmel. Mr. Kimmel has more than 30 years experience in government, environmental policy, and advocacy. He's a national advocate for clean energy and transportation, and a driving force behind the Union of Concerned Scientists Power Ahead campaign, which is building a large and diverse group of clean energy leadership states, action at the state level. Before he joined the union in 2014, he was the commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, an agency with a $100 million budget and 800 employees, including many scientists and engineers. Now, I'm a longtime proud resident of Massachusetts myself, so I know that your leadership at that point in time, when you were involved with the regional greenhouse gas initiative, which succeeded in reducing carbon emissions by 90 million tons. So as a prior Massachusetts resident, I thank you for that. He's a lawyer by training, and early in his career, he served in Governor Deval Patrick's administration as general counsel for the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And Ken's law degree is from UCLA, but more importantly, I was delighted to learn that your undergraduate degree was from Wesleyan. The president of Wesleyan, Michael Roth, is on the Hastings Center board, and several prior Wesleyan board members are now Hastings Center board members. So we know that Wesleyan is a great institution, and it turns out great leaders.
Thank you, Millie, for that great introduction, and thank you so much for making this spectacular space available and for seeing the benefits of this partnership today. And thank all of you. I'm sure you have other things to do on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. Thank you all so much for coming. It's great to see some old friends here as well as some new friends. I'll tell you a little bit about the Union of Concerned Scientists. We too were founded in 1969. That was a good year to start groups of this nature. We were founded by scientists at Harvard and MIT who were distraught with the way that science was being used for primarily destructive purposes, building nuclear weapons and the like. And they had a very simple but powerful idea. Why aren't we harnessing the power of science to solve some of the world's most pressing problems? And almost 50 years later, that is still what the Union of Concerned Scientists mission is. We have over 500,000 members and activists nationwide. We have offices in Cambridge, Washington, D.C., Chicago, and Oakland. I want to underline that because we operate not only at the national level, but increasingly at the state and regional level where real progress can be made. We focus on a number of difficult issues. We don't take on easy ones. We work on climate change. We work on food sustainability. We work on the continued threat of nuclear weapons and unsafe nuclear power plants. And above all, especially right now, we have a Center for Science and Democracy, which is working to maintain, strengthen the role that science plays in public policy. And I probably don't need to tell anyone in this audience how important that really is right now. I think the title of this really captures this perfectly. We live in a very perilous time in this country. We've always been a country that argues pretty vociferously over politics, but until very recently, we at least mostly agreed on what the facts were. And now we've reached a point where we have lost that core a set of agreements, and that's making it very, very difficult to make progress on a lot of fronts. So one antidote to this factual polarization is meetings just like this, where we all have an opportunity to talk about science and technology and inform each other and think about the ways in which that information can be used powerfully to make change. And what's going to happen today, you're going to hear from a number of different speakers speaking on a wide range of issues, but I think there is some connective tissue here, which is each of the speakers in one way or another is going to talk about new technologies that either exist now or will exist on the horizon, and raise the question, how do we make sure that these technologies really serve the public interest and not just private interests? And so I think as we go through today, you'll hear from different people with different perspectives on that. But I am thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to start a partnership with the Hastings Center. I think we're a great fit, and I'm really delighted to be here today. So thank you for making this available to us. So now what I'd like to do is introduce the first panel. Each speaker will talk for about 7 minutes, and we're going to be pretty strict about that to allow for time for questions. We'll then take some time for members of the audience to ask questions, and then we'll go on with the next panel. I won't give long introductions because the speakers' bios are in your packets, but we're going to hear from Josie Johnston, who is the Director of Research at Hastings, and we're going to hear from Peter Frumhoff, the Director of Science and Policy at the Union of Concerned Scientists.
Hi everyone, I don't have long and I do have a New Zealand accent, so bear with me. I'm here, I'm interested in in genetics and in reproductive ethics and law. My background is in law, and today I'm going to focus a little bit on human gene editing and its intersection with reproduction and some of the other technologies that kind of coalesce in this space that's sometimes called reprogenetics. I want to talk a little bit about some of the scientific advances, some of the holes, and then sort of raise this question about what it might mean to do this work responsibly in the context of the realities of human reproduction. So as I'm sure many of you know that there has been this invention in 2012 of a new way of editing genes. Gene editing is not a new idea, and it's not a new thing in terms of an ability for science to do, but it is now much, much easier to do than it was in the past. So this is a big breakthrough, not the first time we could ever alter genes, but the first time we could do it in a very efficient and effective way and very easily. Now, what didn't take long for people to think about what that might mean for human reproduction. So here are a couple of magazine covers sort of introducing this idea of like, can we now engineer the human race? That's directly in response to the gene editing research. But it is, of course, part of a line of questioning that has gone along with developments in reproduction and reproductive technologies and genetics. So it's not a new idea, a new question, but certainly kind of got a big boost as on account of this new gene editing research. Now, it wasn't just people selling magazine publishers who were interested in and concerned potentially about the intersection of gene editing technologies and reproductive science. Also, some of the very people who actually invented the technology and were working on it were concerned about the use generally of gene editing technologies in humans and called for an international discussion that went beyond the boundaries of science to talk about the uses of gene editing in humans and in non-human organisms. And as part of that, they called special attention to the idea of germline gene modification, which is making changes in sperm, eggs, embryos, maybe in fetuses, that can be passed on from one generation to the next. So changes that live within the human genome, generation after generation. So that came in for special scrutiny. Now, as a result of some of this call from these scientists and concerned, some of them were concerned scientists, I believe, there was an international meeting, a summit in Washington, D.C. at the end of 2015. And as part of they issued a statement. And one of the things that they asked for was essentially sort of a halt to the idea of doing gene edits that could be inherited, so these germline modifications, until more attention and more discussion had occurred around those. So this is a New York Times headline from that reporting out of that summit in 2015 saying, scientists seek moratorium on edits to human genome that could be inherited. At the same time, so shortly after this summit, the National Academy of Sciences also put together a panel and did their own large report on the use of gene editing in humans, and they issued a report in February of this year. And this is the cover of their report. Now, their report was actually a little bit less negative about the idea of doing heritable changes. And so their report was interpreted by the media as giving a yellow light to the editing of genes in ways that could be passed on to future generations, and that would primarily be in embryos. So there was a little bit of a move from the International Summit at the end of 2015 to the National Academy's report from the United States at the beginning of this year on this question of like whether or not there really is a sort of line that ought not be crossed to do heritable changes. And we can talk a little bit about the importance of that line or whether it matters at all. At the same time as people are having these conversations to really kind of think about how to use these technologies in heritable, to make heritable modifications, the science is progressing, so simultaneously with the discussion. So here's a news story from 2015 where Chinese scientists have used gene editing technology to eliminate the gene associated with beta thalassemia from embryos. They used non-viable human embryos, which was not something they needed to do scientifically, but was, I think, a signal that they were not doing work that could immediately be translated into human applications and be used to make children without the beta thalassemia gene. But they were looking at a very serious condition. More recently, this year, this summer, there was a report of a US researcher using gene editing to fix a mutation associated with a cardiac problem that can cause sudden death in young people. And that, I have to note that the sort of scientific veracity of that work is under debate. So there's like an interesting active debate going on right now. But like just to point out that like scientists are in fact using gene editing to try to make heritable changes to human embryos at the same time as we're having a conversation about whether or not that would be a good idea. Which isn't necessarily a problem, but just to note the pace at which all of this is moving. This is all in the last 5 years. And of course the media is interested too in asking already these questions about whether it would be mandatory to actually do this kind of thing if you were a prospective parent and you knew that you carried in your family genes associated with a particular condition. This is, I think, a really interesting question because it's taking us all the way back to debates about the eugenics, right? To the eugenics movement, to questions about reproductive choice, and to questions about disability rights and women's rights. So this idea that it might be mandatory or somehow obligatory to use these technologies to make these heritable changes is already being discussed. Now, it's not just gene editing. I want to also point out that we are at the same time engaged in the discussion about whether we should use gene technology, not gene editing, but sequencing technology, which enables us to decode the genome in newborns. And should it really be part of newborn screening? Should all newborns in the country have their genome sequenced? That's a question that's being worked on, and actually we at the Hastings Center are part of projects on that question. Similarly, there is a new prenatal test that can be done from a sample of the mother's blood that can analyse the fragments of placental and fetal DNA floating in the mother's blood. So that is a way to do a very easy test that can reveal a significant amount of information about the fetus. Now, right now, it's a screening test, but there is a very strong likelihood that we will soon be able to take whole fetal cells in this way and be able to do diagnostic genome sequencing on the fetus at around 10 weeks gestation, so very early in pregnancy, and all it would require would be a blood sample taken in any kind of office. So not something where you have to go and have an amnio and have a significant conversation with a genetic counsellor, but something that could be done easily. There's tons of commercial interest in this kind of thing, right? Here's another ad for this company called GenePeaks that tries to figure out whether or not your sperm donor, when mixed with your eggs, might generate a fetus, a baby with particular kinds of genetic problems. But this idea that we would understand ourselves on a genetic level to the extent that we could figure out what the chances are of us procreating with someone else creating a problem, that's absolutely something that where there are commercial interests. And then you get this kind of headline we are at the dawn of choosing embryos by height, weight and more, and this is just from a couple of days ago, November 1st. So it's not hyperbolic to think that we are really truly will truly be facing some of these kinds of questions. And I just also want to point out that there's actually research to try to see if we can make sperm and eggs from skin cells. So that you wouldn't have to go through IVF to make all these eggs and do all this complicated assisted reproductive technologies. We could actually generate germ cells from existing skin cells. So lots of science in this area that's very, and also lots of commercial interest. This is the woman from 23andMe saying that she thinks it's a responsibility to have genetic testing when you are having children. Now, I like to put this slide up, but people in bioethics kind of roll their eyes when you mention this movie Gattaca, which is a film that came out actually 20 years ago last month, looking at the potential future in which everybody's genome is sequenced and understood, and we have a kind of hierarchy of people who have good genomes and people who don't. The scene here is when the couple who have already had one child, sort of a love child, they didn't create this child through any kind of assisted reproductive technologies, they just had him, right? He's the hero of the movie, he's our protagonist. There they are about to have their second child, so they go to the genetic testing lab, get the embryos tested, make sure that anything that's off gets corrected. And in this scene, there's this really interesting ambivalence that they bring to the process that they're engaging in. They're voluntarily turning up, right? This is not a future in which there's a law telling you that you have to do this kind of procreation, but they feel like they are supposed to. Everyone around them is telling them, and he confirms it for them, like this is the right thing to do. But they have this real ambivalence, which I think is something that all of us share, and it's really, I think, where our ethical issues really kind of arise. I just have one more slide, which is I wanted to put up this slide. I think it's absolutely important to talk about the fact that while all of this interesting science is going on, women in the United States are losing access to very simple reproductive technologies in the form of contraception and access to safe and effective abortion. So at the same time as we're racing ahead and encountering all of these questions around eugenics and reproductive ethics, people are actually losing the ability to even prevent pregnancy from occurring. So how you put those two things together, I think, is a really interesting question for us. And that's my final slide.
Let me say thank you so much for the opportunity to come join you today. I'm by training an evolutionary biologist and ecologist, although I work mostly now at the intersection of climate science and public policy. And as a biologist, I've read for years the work of the Hastings Center and long admired your work, so it's just a real honor to be able to join you here today. So as Ken noted, one of the major areas of our work is at the Union of Concerned Scientists is on climate change. And with respect to solutions to climate change, we are fully focused on the essential transition to a clean energy economy, the transition to renewable energies, in particular away from fossil fuels. And we're also beginning to try to wrap our heads around a new set of technologies that are being proposed, being grappled with in the scientific community, that fall under the rubric of climate engineering. I want to talk to you a little bit about this. We're just very much at the front end of thinking about our work on this, potentially moving forward, and the ethical dimensions of it per se. So in 1991, in June of 1991, when Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines, it sent 15 to 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, about 20 kilometers, about 12 miles high, where that sulfur dioxide formed sulfate aerosols, tiny reflecting particles that over the course of several weeks, and actually extended over the course of the next couple of years, spread throughout the stratosphere, and had many impacts on the ozone layer, on precipitation patterns, but importantly had an impact on global average temperature. Those tiny reflecting particles reflected about 1% of the incoming solar radiation back to space, and led to a cooling of the Earth for the period of time in which those aerosols were in the stratosphere. Again, they settled out in the course of 1 to 2 years, of about 0.5 degrees Celsius. Okay? That's a large amount of cooling. And there were lots of changes that were characterized that we could observe during that time. Now, climate models quite accurately captured the impact of that temporary cooling by the injection of sulfate aerosol. We sort of take this into account. It's part of the natural variability, the drivers of natural variability in the Earth's climate. Climate models also capture the heat trapping effect of carbon dioxide CO2 as opposed to SO2, as the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation inject those into the atmosphere. The heat-trapping properties of carbon dioxide are also well known and captured in climate models. And we know that we've already seen, as a result of the emissions of carbon dioxide to date, that global temperatures have increased about 1 degree Celsius, about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit, and that we're on a trajectory for them to go well above the 2 degrees Celsius target that we've all, or well below 2 degrees target that nations, although the U.S. of course is now stepping out of this, or at least aiming to under the Trump administration, captured within the Paris Agreement. Now we all know well the very dangerous impacts of climate change associated with the rising carbon dioxide levels and other heat-trapping gases. I'm not going to go into those today. But we also know, and this is sort of not something we lead with in our advocacy work, to be honest, but we're also well aware within the scientific community just how daunting the challenge is to make the transition to clean energy rapidly enough to be able to keep global temperatures to what would be inarguably safe levels, well below the increase of 2 degrees Celsius, perhaps 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the kind of aspirational target within the Paris Agreement. And in that context of recognizing just how daunting that challenge is, we really need to bring emissions of fossil fuels to zero in the next couple of decades. Huge challenge, a hugely essential challenge, but nonetheless a very big challenge. We may not get there, and in the context of recognizing that, a number of scientists are beginning to explore, mostly in the context of computer models to date, what the implications might be if we were to, for example, mimic volcanoes by, and this is kind of technically relatively simple, sending a fleet of Gulfstream aircraft into the stratosphere to release sulfate aerosols or other reflecting aerosols on a regular, somewhat continual basis as a complement, as a supplement to aggressive reductions in heat-trapping gases. Imagine, for example, we got to a place where we saw that the Greenland or West Antarctic ice sheets were beginning to really destabilize, driving massive increases in sea level. And a nation, perhaps a rogue nation, perhaps the United States, I won't say that those are the same, might decide on their own, in the absence of global governance initiatives that are really not yet all established, to decide to take action to rapidly, relatively rapidly, in the order of weeks to months, inject aerosols in the stratosphere to cool the planet. I like to think of this as the worst possible way to address climate change that we need to take seriously. I should say that this particular climate engineering technology is one of several climate engineering, or sometimes called geoengineering, technologies that are being considered, explored to various degrees within the scientific community. They include technologies to change the reflectance or albedo of the Earth. This is one of them. It's this one in the upper right, increasing the reflectivity of aerosols into the stratosphere. There are also technologies, which I won't spend a lot of time on, but just to note, that fall under the basket of technologies to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They happen more slowly. Some of them are well known, planting trees. Right? Photosynthesis has been around for a while as a well-understood technology, and you can plant trees and draw carbon out of the atmosphere. The challenge with these carbon capture and storage technologies is that they either require lots of land or lots of energy or lots of water, and they don't happen as quickly as do the potential for changing the reflectance of the stratosphere. So people are researching these. I should say the National Research Council under the National Academy has done studies to assess both of these suites of technologies. They're now gaining, I would say, some currency and legitimacy in terms of publications in the scientific community. The Climate Science Special Report that just got released yesterday, the first climate science report that came out relatively unscathed in the Trump administration just yesterday, also has a significant chapter on mitigation, which includes a serious discussion of these carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management or solar geoengineering reflecting technologies. So it's beginning to be grappled with in a scientifically serious way. Where ethical considerations come in, and there are many of them, where they're beginning to, and I'll just say the question of, just to name a couple, should these ever be deployed, who gets to decide who controls the thermostat, right? Whose decision is that? And suppose that different nations or different groups have very different ideas about what that should be. How would those geopolitical challenges get resolved? I noted that climate models can understand the just based on modeling, the temperature changes, but the regional changes in precipitation, for example, and other changes in climate are really not well understood at all. And there's a lot more to understand about how these technologies might have, if they were deployed, both their intended and unintended consequences, and what the distribution of those risks and consequences might be. This is no picnic. And so there are, in my view, deep ethical questions about them, and they are coming to the fore, in particular, both as we begin to talk about the challenges of keeping below 2 degrees, and also in particular, some scientists are beginning to advocate and plan for what would be the first atmospheric field tests of these technologies. So there's a group at Harvard, for example, a group of scientists that are funded by Bill Gates and others, who are planning to do some, what are, I would argue, inarguably small-scale, relatively low-risk experiments, in which these are intended to take place in Arizona in the next year or two, where they want to really test understanding of how aerosol particles get distributed in the stratosphere to better understand what would happen if they would be released at scale. Different kinds of particles, not just sulfate aerosols, but other potential types of aerosols that might be used as well. And they're planning to release these aerosols. This is just a kind of cartoon of what this might look like in a tethered balloon experiment, where they would be able to both release the aerosols over an area of 1 kilometer wide, 20 kilometers up in the stratosphere, quite high up, and then run back through the cloud in order to sample and understand the distributional properties. These are not big experiments, but nonetheless, they're kind of the camel's nose under the tent, and there is no governance, no broad rules that would identify under what conditions such experiments might take place. And they're beginning to drive, within those who are paying attention to this, real conversations about whether and under what conditions such experiments might be done, who should decide, and what are the implications for the kind of inevitable interest in building on these experiments to larger experiments that would actually look at the impacts of the release of aerosols over much larger areas, and perhaps accelerate the interest in deployment. And there are, of course, lots of concerns, including what gets carried out under the rubric of a moral hazard, that as we begin to explore these kinds of technologies and their potential to rapidly cool the planet, to what extent would they reduce the interest of at least some nations in the essential need to reduce emissions? One of the things that's about to give that some attention is next Wednesday, the House Science Committee, currently but not for long chaired by Lamar Smith of Texas, who just announced his resignation, some of you may know, a couple days ago, is holding the first hearings in Congress on solar geoengineering technologies, and actually exploring the notion of federal funding for this. My own view is that no self-respecting scientist should take funding from a government which is not fully committed to emissions reductions. And we're trying to propagate that idea within the expert community. A number of people are signing on to a letter that will be going to the House Science Committee, making this point from leading researchers in this field. But the fundamental ethical questions remain. Who decides? And in particular, what I've just begun trying to understand, I'm going to leave you with this thought, because really, again, just at the front end of this, is so there are political decision makers, governments, but this is also sort of a public participation question. We are all, in a sense, human subjects in the context of these potentially global scale releases. As experiments get larger, the question of who gets to decide and what informed consent looks like is a question which we are just beginning to try to find ways to elevate and wrestle with and bring to the scientific community, who is really thinking about this, not surprisingly, in a relatively narrow technical way. And so I'm actually very interested in exploring with colleagues here and more broadly, those who have really dealt with the notion of informed consent in the context of human subjects research, both biomedical and psychological, how the history of that took place. Obviously, it started after World War II in a major way, built over time, including with informal agreements among scientists about what standards for responsible science looked like, obviously leading to regulatory oversight in many cases. But I believe we need to have a serious conversation within the geoengineering research community, more broadly in the climate science community, over the notion of informed consent and the question of how to bring stakeholders who are not just local but are in fact global into a conversation about whether and under what conditions not just deployment of these technologies should be considered, but active research with its catalytic nature of driving interest in deployment. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
It's very nice to be here. What I thought I would talk about, we had decided to talk a little bit about the North Korean threat. Given the interest of people in this group and the kind of work that UCS has done over the years, excuse me, I wanted to discuss two issues related to technologies that are related that we've worked on over the years. The first one is North Korea's development of nuclear and missile technologies. This is an issue that we've been following since the early 1990s, both to understand what North Korea is capable of building, how fast the threat might develop, and also what you can do about it. In the 1990s, the Clinton administration became concerned about North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons and started negotiating with North Korea. And that resulted in 1994 in something called the TheAgreed Framework, which was a set of basic principles that sort of outlined a way to proceed, but also put very strict limitations on North Korea's ability to make plutonium for weapons, and added international verification. And the Clinton administration then followed those negotiations with a new set of negotiations in the late 1990s to build on that and try and extend the agreement. So if you talk to the negotiators, what you hear was that they thought they were a couple months from a final agreement that would have stopped North Korea's ability to produce plutonium and would have gotten rid of North Korea's ballistic missile program. And at that point, time ran out in the Clinton administration. It was 2001. The Bush administration came in and was very split on its North Korea policy. And as a result, it put the negotiations on hold, and they never really came back. And despite sort of people noticing that things were going forward, both the United States over the next really 10 years unfortunately didn't get back to the negotiating table in the same way. And I think didn't prioritize this issue to the extent that they probably should have. Now, there are a number of reasons for that, but I want to call out two that I think are particularly important. One was, I think, a general problem of underestimating North Korea's technical capabilities and also its ability to be innovative, which I think led to a lack of urgency about trying to solve the problem. So I think it moved it down the list of priorities that people had. And the other issue that I think played a role in this was overestimating the capability of a different technology, which was missile defense. And so that's the second technology I want to say a little bit about, so let me turn to that. Missile defense was one of the first issues that UCS worked on when it was started in 1969, and I guess it says something about either our ability to work on this problem or the difficulty of it that we're continuing to work on this problem, and it's something that I still spend a lot of time on. Building a missile defense system has been a priority for a lot of policymakers over the years, in part because they see it as a way that U.S. technical prowess can help us deal with the very difficult problem of the spread of missiles and the spread of nuclear weapons. The United States was concerned about North Korean missiles in the early 2000s, and as a result of that, the Bush administration decided to start deploying a missile defense system. So it was the first time that the U.S. in recent history had made a decision to start actually deploying missile defense technology. But there were a couple problems, and the first one was that the basic technology at that point still hadn't been developed. But to allow the deployment of these things to go forward, the Congress exempted the missile defense system from basic Pentagon processes of testing requirements and oversight requirements. So the goal became to get the systems deployed in the field quickly, and what ended up happening was some of the technology that was put in the field before it had actually been tested. Now, that lack of oversight has continued up to the present day, so over the last 15 years. And as a result of that, the missile defense system today is having a lot of problems. And in fact, this is an issue that we've looked at pretty carefully. In back, you'll find the executive summary of a report that we wrote a year and a half ago, which looked back over the last 15 years and looked at the result of the problems of insufficient testing and insufficient oversight and where it's led the program to. But it turns out that there are even more fundamental problems with the system than that, and that's something that we looked at in 2000, 2001. UCS pulled together a technical panel of experts to look at how missile defense technology could be fooled by decoys and other things that required technology that was less sophisticated than the missiles and nuclear weapons that an attacker was assumed to be able to build. Now, the result of that is that today we don't have an effective defense, and I don't believe we'll have an effective defense in the foreseeable future. The problem is that even building a bad missile defense, trying to put the technology out in the field, can cause various types of problems. One of those is, while it can't reliably protect the United States from a missile attack, I think it did, as I said, tend to keep people from taking the North Korean threat as seriously as they should have. So I think it actually drained away some of the urgency of following diplomatic efforts to deal with North Korea, with the idea that we had this missile defense system and could deal with the problem if it arose. I also think it can be very dangerous to suggest to military and political leaders that they have defense capabilities that they don't in fact have. And you'll see in our report that's I think an issue that has to be taken seriously. And finally, one of the things that concerns me is that it has, missile defense tends to undermine arms control. The reason that international discussions about missile defense first started was that in the process of trying to reduce offensive weapons, it became clear that there was a link between offensive and defensive weapons. And that link still holds. And so one of the things we're seeing today is that Russia is refusing to talk about more arms control cuts. China is starting to slowly build up its arsenal. And people in those countries are telling us that those decisions are linked to the U.S. decision to push forward with missile defenses. So let me go back to the North Korean threat then and talk about just very briefly where we are today. After negotiations with North Korea stopped in the early 2000s, North Korea started testing its missiles again. And following a rapid set of tests in the last couple years under the new leader, Kim Jong-un, they've now tested missiles that in principle can reach the United States. How capable those are depend on some of the details we don't know. But if they don't have the ability to reach the United States with a long-range missile and a nuclear weapon today, I think they will have in the very near future. North Korea carried out its first nuclear test in 2006. That one didn't work very well, but it's done 6 total tests now. Its most recent one in early September was almost certainly a hydrogen bomb test, had a yield about 10 times the yield of the Hiroshima bomb. So we're now in a situation where North Korea has what I believe is a threat that could be quite serious. And so that raised the question, what are the options for trying to deal with this? Well, I've argued that missile defense is not going to be a technical fix to the solution. Military options, which is one of the other things you'll hear a lot about, even the Trump administration advisors are saying are not a good fix. And the problem there is that the South Korean capital of Seoul is within artillery range of North Korea. North Korea has thousands of artillery tubes focused on Seoul. They have conventional weapons for them. They have chemical warheads for them. So the concern is that if the United States tried to do some sort of military strike, it wouldn't know where all of North Korea's military assets were, and it would lead to the devastation of Seoul. And if you look at some of the estimates of the destruction that could cause, it's a very daunting sort of thing. And I think where that leads you is that really diplomacy is the only way forward at the present time. And fortunately, I think the Clinton experience shows us that there's some hope that may be possible, although we're in a very different time period. We're working with a different regime, so I think there's no guarantee. But I think the first step that needs to happen is that there needs to be something done to try and reduce the current tensions between the United States and North Korea, because my biggest concern at this point is that as tensions increase, as people make decisions and draw red lines, that you could get in a situation where some sort of accident, some sort of crisis could happen, which could lead to an exchange that neither side really wanted to do. So I think the first step is to try and reduce the current level of tensions. And I think the way to do that at this point is the United States should send a high-level envoy to North Korea and basically start informal talks to say, let's figure out what we could talk about, what the format would be, and let's see if it's possible to move forward. So I'm happy to talk about any of this later, but let me stop at that point.
Thank you, David, for that sobering talk. I'm going to talk about a technology that a few years ago I think most people would think of as science fiction, which is the concept of autonomous vehicles or driverless vehicles. And it's happening before our very eyes. Google has driven these cars millions of miles and is collecting important data on their safety. Uber now has driverless vehicles in Pittsburgh that people can ride. And all of the major car companies are positioning themselves to be suppliers of these driverless vehicles. So I'm not going to talk about whether these vehicles are safe or not, nor am I going to talk about the very significant socioeconomic impacts of having all of our cab drivers and Lyft drivers and Uber drivers suddenly lose their jobs to autonomous vehicles. I'm going to focus on a somewhat narrower issue. I'm going to ask the question, are driverless vehicles going to help us in the fight on climate change, or are they going to make it harder? And what can we do to make sure that it's the former rather than the latter? You can imagine both a utopian case for these vehicles and a dystopian case. And being a glass half full type of person, I'm going to start with the utopian case. The utopian case is this, that one of the fundamental challenges in getting the carbon emissions out of transportation is what I call the long carbon shadow of our existing fleet of cars. And what I mean by that is we can improve technologies, we can come up with ways of making cars cleaner and more efficient. But the problem is people buy cars that last 10 or 15 or 20 years. And so even if we're dramatically improving how clean our new cars are, we have this long carbon shadow from all the cars that people have purchased in the past. So figuring out a way to turn over the fleet more quickly from dirty cars to clean cars is a key challenge. And it just might be the case that driverless vehicles can help us there. There are two important economic drivers here. One is this, that if you take the driver out of a cab service or an Uber service or a Lyft service, the price per mile of that transportation goes dramatically down. And it goes down so much that for many, many people, it won't make sense to own a car, which is, after all, an asset that you buy that mostly sits in a garage that you barely use. The economics will be much more favorable for not owning a car, but rather calling these autonomous vehicles when you need them, and then not using them when you don't. And that could happen very, very quickly. The second driver here is that the case for electrifying these autonomous vehicles is very, very strong. And that's because while electric vehicles may cost more when you first buy them, they cost far less to operate. Electricity is much cheaper than gasoline per mile. These cars are incredibly simple and have much lower maintenance costs and operation costs. So the more you drive, the more it makes sense for a car to be electric. And so autonomous vehicles, which are intended to be driven a lot of the time, will have a natural incentive to be electric. So you can see that this technology offers a way for us to move away from people owning their cars, which are mostly gas-fired, and to instead using driverless vehicles as a service, which are mostly electric. And that could have significant advantages for getting the carbon emissions out of transportation. There's two other technologies, though, which we can layer on top, which give it even more promise. One is all the algorithms that have been developed by Uber and Lyft that encourage people to share their rides. And of course, it's simple math. If you're driving alone, and then if you have a passenger come in, and so it's two people instead of one, you've reduced your carbon per mile by 50% just by having another driver. And I do think that when we move away from this model ownership where you're owning your own car and you think about it as your own space, and instead you're getting into an autonomous vehicle, perhaps that changes the psychology and people are more open to the idea of sharing that vehicle. We don't expect when we go on a bus or a train to be sitting alone. And that same dynamic could happen with these driverless vehicles. The expectation will be that the car will be full or at least have more people in it. The other technology, which is very exciting, is the way in which we could ensure that these big fleets of driverless vehicles do most of their charging when renewable energy is at peak use in the grid. So in California, that would mean having these cars largely charge up during the day when there's a lot of solar energy. In the East Coast, it might mean charging these cars at night when we have offshore wind farms powering our electric grid. So we have a great opportunity here to put this all together. And from a land use perspective, one can imagine in cities where so much of our land is devoted to parking lots, that we could get rid of some of those parking lots and we could have open space and other things that make our cities livable. So that's the utopian case. Now for the dystopian case. All these things may not happen exactly as I pointed out. The dystopian case is that despite the economics of electric vehicles, the internal combustion engine is sticky and these AVs are fired by gasoline, just like regular cars. And the service itself is so inexpensive that people use it as a substitute for taking a bus or taking a train or walking or riding their bicycle. And they are not interested in sharing the space with other people because the only thing that's on their mind is getting from point A to point B as fast as possible, and they don't want to be slowed down. And if all of those things happen, we will so dramatically increase the number of miles that these vehicles are traveling that we could offset the benefits of having cleaner cars. And instead of having these parking spaces and these livable cities full of places for people to walk around, you can imagine cities where there are these robots on wheels swarming around the city and making our life less pleasant. So I don't know which direction we're going to go here. Here's what I do know, though. The time is right now for us to establish our expectations and our norms and our rules of the road for how this technology is going to serve the public interest. And I would submit to you that we need an agreed set of principles. I can think of at least 4. One is that these cars need to be electric, or at least have the same efficiency as an electric car. So they don't have to be electric, but they have to have the same grams per mile as the best electric cars. 2, to the maximum extent possible, they need to be shared rides rather than people taking these rides on their own. 3, they need to complement rather than substitute for our mass transit and other public services. And 4, they need to be fully integrated and aligned with our renewable energy goals. So I think the first step is to agree on that set of principles, and then we've got to figure out how to implement them. And that's a complicated subject because transportation is regulated at the federal level and the state level and the local level. And it's not clear who has jurisdiction over what. But I want to give you one example that's close to home. During my time in state government, Massachusetts decided to have casinos. And I didn't actually support that decision, but it was made. What do casinos have to do with this? Well, we wisely decided not to just let people build whatever casinos they wanted, and it was sort of the first person to get the permits and get on the ground wins. We set up a licensing process, and we only were going to give away 3 licenses, and we established public interest criteria that the license applicants would have to fulfill in order to get the license. And I think one thing that ought to happen pretty quickly is that when some of these companies want to come into a city or a state, we establish some laws and some bidding processes, and we insist that the winning, or we give an incentive for these companies as part of the receipt of their license to come up with really good commitments to electrifying their fleet, to making it very inexpensive and cheap for people to share rides, a plan to really get people who don't have good access to public transportation, and to work with our utility companies so these vehicles are charging up at times when we're using renewable energy. So in other words, I think there are two potential futures here, or maybe somewhere in between, and the future that we get from this new technology depends upon all the work that we do now to shape it to our liking. Thank you.
We are with the genetic editing of non-human organisms making a great leap forward. Josie talked about the leap forward that we might be able to make with human gene editing, but it looks actually more feasible, because the research is in some ways easier to do, with non-human organisms. And the thing that's really interesting to me about what we can do, or on the cusp of being able to do with non-human organisms, is that we're about to open up whole new categories of applications. All right, so you can think of the classic applications on non-human organisms as being in agriculture, all the GMOs, crops. Some talk about livestock and fish, not much progress. There is some work in the industrial context, especially with microbial organisms. Genetically modified cyanobacteria might be a way of producing ethanol in a way that is considerably greener than we can now produce ethanol. And we might be able to produce other kinds of things with genetically modified microorganisms. An anti-malarial from a modified yeast, for example. There are also some possible medical applications. There are some applications in the home with the so-called glowing plant project and the glowfish. Even art, actually. A genetically modified bunny called Alba is best example of that, maybe. But now we're getting to a point where, in addition to all these human contexts, we can talk about the genetic modification of non-human organisms in non-human contexts. So we can talk about genetic editing in the wild, introducing genetically modified organisms into the wild, and maybe beginning to actually genetically edit populations, even potentially species. And so actually this is one of the connections to Peter Frumhoff's talk. There is a sense in which this is becoming geoengineering, and it could even be used directly for the purposes of geoengineering. That's been talked about a little bit. So just to hear a few examples. My favorite example, having to do with my history, my childhood growing up in East Tennessee, is the work that's going on right now in the SUNY Environmental Sciences and Forestry, ESF, to genetically modify the American chestnut so that it can withstand the chestnut blight that 100 years ago and change was introduced to this country and completely obliterated a species that was the dominant tree throughout much of the East. 25% of the trees out here probably would have been the American chestnut. It was a spectacular tree, the redwood of the East, also a valuable tree, a lumber tree. Another example that's been much in the news is a proposal from the British company Oxitec to use genetic editing to tweak pest insects, mosquitoes, also a moth, as a way of controlling populations. Their proposal is that they can actually genetically modify vast quantities of males, modify them so that they contain a so-called self-limiting gene. You release these huge populations into the wild, and when they mate with wild-type mosquitoes, all of the progeny will perish. So this can be a way they have proposed of controlling the Aedes aegypti mosquito, which doesn't often, but can transmit dengue in the Florida Keys. And they've also proposed it for the diamondback moth in California. And they're trying right now to go forward with field release sort of trials of this. But in addition to, in a way, these are kind of conventional forms of genetic editing for non-human organisms. I've been involved over the last couple of years on a couple of kind of colorful developments which might significantly augment our capacities to begin to edit the wild. One of these is what's known as gene drives. A gene drive is a process, not a thing, actually. It refers to a process by which a genetic element, such as a gene, is passed from parent to progeny at a rate greater than would be predicted by traditional Mendelian genetics. So rather than 50% transmission, you might have 80, 90, maybe in the limit case, approaching 100% transmission. And then in the progeny, it does the same thing. It carries along. So all of the genetically modified organisms' progeny will contain this new trait. And then all of their progeny can contain the new trait, assuming it's evolutionarily stable, and so on, until eventually this trait can be driven through an entire population and potentially an entire species. This is being proposed as a way of, let me walk through some of the applications. The leading application is driven by the Gates Foundation, and it's a proposal to suppress populations of the Anopheles complex of mosquitoes, which transmit Plasmodium, which causes malaria. So they are now working slowly toward development of this drive, and even beginning to prepare some release sites in Burkina Faso, Uganda, and Mali. There might also be some. There's some other applications in public health. There might be some applications in agriculture. I served on a National Academies of Science committee that developed some recommendations for responsible conduct of research on gene drives, and we began the report with a series of possible applications, starting with mosquitoes, and then introducing some agricultural applications. There are also some applications in conservation, which is a very interesting use of genetic editing. A group called Island Conservation is supporting research to consider ways of suppressing invasive rodent populations on ocean islands where they threaten nesting seabirds, which may be nesting on the ground, so have no evolved protection really from these predators. And in this case, you have what looks on the one hand like, given the kind of conversation we've had about GMOs in agriculture, it looks like a highly invasive way of intervening in nature, but the goal of it actually is a preservationist instinct. And it reaches this preservationist goal, ostensibly in theory, that the protection of these rookeries, in what is in some ways a less invasive way than the traditional ways of protecting these rookeries, which involve sending people in waves onto these islands and trapping or poisoning all of the animals that are there. And you have to go back and you have to do it again and again, because one pregnant female means that the whole effort has failed. So there's some extraordinary applications here. This is what I think of really as a kind of extinction technology. The goal of it is to, in these applications, the goal is to replace a genome that is in the wild with something else. You're getting rid of something that's in the wild and creating something else in its stead, or maybe just getting rid of it. But on the other end of the new possibilities that genetic editing gives us is what's being called de-extinction, which is, just as it sounds, the effort to recreate lost species. The Long Now Foundation, headed by Stuart Brand, who of Whole Earth catalog fame, is funding work that George Church and some others at Harvard are doing to try to bring back the woolly mammoth, the passenger pigeon, which once flew overhead in these skies in stupendous flocks that numbered in the billions probably. It would take hours to pass overhead and darken the skies. Also on the heath hen, and then there's some other work going on, sometimes using other kinds of technologies, not genetic editing technologies, but more conventional breeding technologies elsewhere in the world on other species. So the question that animates my work, I'm trained as a philosopher. The question that animates my work, the overarching question is, how do we sort through this stuff? What would constitute good use of these technologies? How do we decide what we're going to do and what we're not going to do? And in my work, I tend to break that down into three big kinds of questions. One of them really is just kind of what are we actually doing? What really is at stake? These questions are aimed at seeking clarity. Just the terms that I've thrown at you so far, genetic engineering. In what sense, really, are we doing genetic engineering of these organisms, if by that we mean design-driven alteration with a set goal in mind? And to what degree is it more like sort of hacking and hoping that things work out? De-extinction. In what sense, really, are we accomplishing de-extinction of the organisms that we're talking about bringing back? I have just sort of wrapped up a project on de-extinction that led to this special report that was published in the journal I edit a couple months ago, and we have some extra copies in back. Possibly not enough for everyone in the room, but feel free to take one on your way out. Most of the essays in this are devoted to this clarifying kind of question. What can we actually accomplish with this, and what really can we claim to be doing? Another big set of questions has to do with the moral stakes. What constitutes good use here? What are the relevant values that should be brought to play? Obviously, with some of these applications, there are stupendous potential benefits. With the application that Gates is funding to control the Anopheles complex just long enough to eliminate malaria. That's how they describe it. There are hundreds of millions of people who die each year from malaria, mostly children, mostly in developing countries. It would be a very significant benefit if that can be achieved. Some of these other applications I'm describing, the benefit is a little bit harder to articulate in as compelling a way. I think especially that's the case with some of these de-extinction strategies. Often it looks like the goal has a little bit more to do with just the excitement of the science per se. It's cool. I mean, were there a woolly mammoth in the neighborhood that had been created, might go see it. It would be it would be worth a day trip. But is that kind of benefit really enough to go forward with this kind of application? There are also some very considerable risks. A gene drive is designed to be contagious, as Josie put it. It's designed to be invasive. That is what it does. And most of the applications I'm describing, not the Gates Anopheles complex application, but say the island conservation work to control rodent populations on islands, these applications are meant to affect a particular population, not an entire species. But then the question is, can you actually limit it to that species on that island? The species got there somehow or other to begin with. If it gets off, then what happens? So that's just one example of the kind of risk that gene drives present. One of the agricultural applications that we look at in the Academy's report is a strategy to control pigweed which is a weed in the southeast that causes a lot of economic damage to farmers, but is grown as a crop in some South American countries. So you can see how that might, the risks that might raise. There's also just a lot of uncertainty. And one of the questions for a philosopher here is just how do we think about uncertainty, and can we capture the feelings we have about it through the standard mechanisms for impact assessment, like cost-benefit analysis? And does that matter? Ought we to be giving a little extra weight to the concerns that some people might have about uncertainty? The uncertainties with gene drives are very easy to describe. Will the gene drive work in the organism as intended, or will it have off-target effects? Will it jump to another organism through lateral genetic transmission? Will the modified organism behave as intended in the environment, or will something else go awry? That's a complex system. And then will the social and economic effects, if that's part of what one's seeking to achieve, will those pan out as envisioned? So you have layers of complex systems interacting with each other. So there's all sorts of room for things to go awry. And then there's this question that Josie was working around too in a different context. How do we feel about the kinds of interventions that we are making here? What are our goals about the human relationship to nature? And one of the things that's really interesting to me about the gene drive applications is that they really bring this to the fore in a powerful way. I think it's been a big issue with other kinds of applications, like in the agricultural context. I think a lot of the opposition to GMOs has been grounded on concerns not actually about safety, but about the human relationship to nature. But when you're talking about gene drives, that really comes front and center. And then you have to think, all right, can we talk about that? Can we articulate that? And can we give that the weight that we want to, that it seems to deserve? So I have generally in my work, and I do in the last essay in this special report, tried to argue that these broader concerns are often excluded from the public conversation about these technologies, but we need to find a way of creating space for them and bringing them into play. And then the last kind of question that goes under this big question about how shall we go forward is the question that Peter was giving us. What does good decision-making look like here? And partly this is a matter of who decides, who's at the table. And this is partly a question about the international harmonization of protocols. This is a technology, again, that it would be easy. I can't remember who asked the question about rogue actors, but this is a very live issue with gene drives. And again, a gene drive to do something with pigweed in the United States, we might go forward with that because our cost-benefit analyses don't actually happen to give weight to the effect in developing in South American countries. And then the last part of this, what does good decision-making looks like question is a matter of substance. How do we actually sort through? I've tried to give a sense that these are potentially very powerful applications, potentially very frivolous applications, and we need to find a way of accepting some, I think, carefully, and creating space for stopping others. I argued, this is both in the Academy's report and it's in a science essay that I published last year. I have argued that the Academy's report endorses a kind of precautionary approach. All right? Precaution is often described as grounded in fear of novelty, fear of new science. Proponents of the science certainly see precaution as serving that kind of purpose. But the science itself is often grounded partly on sort of excitement about novelty. And I think the case of de-extinction is a really good example of that. There's a kind of what we call in that science essay innovation thrill that can drive the science forward. And I think that what we need with these technologies is a precautionary approach that will create mechanisms for really broaching and articulating these values questions, for bringing in the right group of stakeholders into the decision-making process, engaging the public in a meaningful way, which Millie will get into in a moment, and staging or phasing the science in such a way that you can sort of incrementally understand the application that you're developing, clarify, gain clarity on how well it's working, whittle away at the uncertainties, and so walk some sort of line between risk panics, concerns about novelty, and the innovation thrill, sort of inappropriate attachment.
Thanks. So I have the benefit of listening to these 5 incredible presentations, and I think it's really obvious the through line is that these are incredibly transformative technologies that could be wonderfully beneficial, and we've had utopian views of how they might be used, and then we have dystopian views. And so I think the through line is that we need deliberation, governance, and enlightened regulation. We need sound science policy. Bioethics fits in there because our scholarship illuminates the values that are at stake and illuminates value conflicts and helps policymakers negotiate value conflicts. If we weren't looking at values, these would only be conversations about efficiency. Does something work and does it work efficiently? Our job is to help dig out what the deeper values are that are at stake. Scientists have an incredible role to play here. That's obvious. On the front line of discovery, they're the first people to identify the issues, especially safety issues, but also other issues as well. And the Hastings Center has a real commitment to identifying scientists who care about the societal impact of their work. That's why we were so delighted to do this with UCS. We have Nobel laureates and leading scientists on our board, on our advisory council, and in nearly every work group that we coalesce for our projects. So bioethicists, scientists, but that is certainly not enough. Bioethics, in a democracy, professional expertise is not sufficient. We also need to find a way for the public and various publics to weigh in. Now, every administration from Ronald Reagan forward, except today's administration, has had a presidential bioethics commission. And these commissions have published a wide variety of very thoughtful reports on a huge number of issues similar to the ones we're talking about today. And all of them, in the last chapter, look alike. You could almost substitute them. They all call for public engagement on these issues. They all say what I'm saying here, that there has to be facts, we need scientists, but the public actually has to tell us what they think, otherwise it's just lip service to democracy. But this is much more aspirational than it really is anything we've achieved in practice. It's a punt to public engagement. We have not figured out how to do this. And that there are both conceptual reasons why we haven't figured it out, and there are practical reasons. And in the time I have with you, I'm just going to mention a couple of each, but there's actually a lot more than what we're going to talk about. So for the conceptual challenges, one challenge is that there isn't one public. There are many publics. And we really don't know how to manage these variety of publics. Should it be the case that a vocal minority should stop something that many, many people and experts might think would be beneficial? And the reverse. Should the majority always override a minority? And then who counts as a stakeholder? So in some policy areas, you have to have a direct impact on the person. The technology has to have a direct impact in order for you to count as having a voice that's got authority or a place. So we don't really know how to deal with the multiplicity of publics. And then another conceptual challenge is the tension between expertise itself and public views. So for example, even if we all agreed on something, even if there was a vast consensus in the public against, you fill in the blank, should we take that seriously? I mean, if we really mean that public engagement is central to democracy, then if you begin to ask the public and their views are different from what experts think they should have, what do you do with that tension? We don't like to acknowledge that. In fact, if you look really carefully at how public engagement is sometimes talked about in science and science policy, if you look really carefully, it really just means, oh, we need to do education that will pull the public along with us. That's not real democracy. But then on the other hand, we don't want a society that's not going to benefit from real expertise. So there's an inbuilt tension between expertise and public views, some of which may differ from expertise for very different reasons. Some of those differences might be gross misperceptions, climate change. Or they could just be genuinely different views about what the right thing is to do that are still in opposition to what experts' consensus might be. So, and then in terms of practical challenges, I'll name two. It's really hard to know how to scale public engagement. It's great that we have about 45 people in this room, but will you please go out and get another 100 each? You know, how do we scale all this? And then, most recently, how do we solve the echo chamber problem? It's such a paradox and so distressing that the internet, which in so many ways is a great leveler and a great way to enhance democracy, is also now creating echo chambers on the internet that is responsible for so much distrust and polarization. So I tried to keep this really tight and use most of my time to describe problems with public engagement. But I thought maybe I did that subconsciously because I'm supposed to now talk about some remedies. And it's really hard to believe that we know exactly what we should be doing next. It seems it seems almost audacious to think that we know how to work ourselves out of the mess that we now all depressed ourselves with at the end of the afternoon. And considering, you know, the level of civic discord that we face, it's really hard to know what to do. So I'm going to take the plunge. I'm going to name a few things, and they're just meant to tee up a conversation. And then I'm going to stop, and we'll use the last bit of time before wine and cheese to have a more robust conversation among all of you. But I'll share with you a few ideas. So I think that this is obvious, we need leaders. Stating the obvious first. We need leaders, and we need leaders of a special kind who can articulate a narrative of common purpose, collective problem solving, and the value of compromise. There's a great political philosopher, Charles Taylor, Canadian, who has pointed out that in pluralistic societies, different ethnic groups, and I would add different socioeconomic classes, need to feel that they're a part of something together, that they are pursuing a common goal, namely a community that can do collective problem solving and take everybody's interests to heart, or at least as many interests to heart as possible. And he points out that when you lose that sense of common purpose, then pluralistic societies devolve into warring tribes. And that's exactly what we're seeing happening right now. Taylor wasn't only a philosopher, he was also a politician, an interesting combination. And his focus on finding a narrative that could instill a sense of common purpose really helped to avert the Quebecois movement from seceding from Canada. So I think that's one of the things we have to figure out. We need leaders, and we need a narrative like this. Another step is trustworthy ways for the public to learn. This is a crisis. We're here, we're a super educated crowd. We have our own ways of finding information from very elite sources, I would imagine. But there are 300 million people here. We have lost trustworthy ways for people to gain information, and I'm just going to talk about 3 of those that perhaps we can do something about, and I can say a little bit about the small role the Hastings Center is doing in each of those areas. So one is rebuilding journalism. Not even before the current administration's attack on journalism, well before, journalism became a business. It's corporatized. It's fueled by the focus on profits. And we don't have a revenue model for in-depth analysis and investigation. So it's a business model that's broken and is searching for a way to be revived. For our small part at the Hastings Center, we have a real commitment to this. Josie mentioned it. We see a big part of our mission as educating journalists. We answer about 200 calls a year from journalists, and we're quoted in many of those, but in many we're not. We're just giving them background so that they'll be smart about how they talk about this. We've also taken to co-sponsoring the annual meetings of the membership societies. So the Association of Health Journalists, there is such a thing, and there is also a World Federation of Science Writers, and we have been co-sponsoring their events and holding pre-conference workshops with them on selected topics. Some of us just got back from San Francisco where we did a half-day workshop on gene editing with Greg and Josie, actually on the same 2 topics, and trying to support careful reporting. Obviously, we have to fix the social media echo chamber problem. I think it's great that Facebook and Twitter and Google, I think it was, had to testify before Congress a couple days ago. I'm watching carefully a major multi-million-dollar grant that the Knight Foundation has made to try to redesign some of the flaws in that allow advertisers who really don't want to advertise on fake sites or on vicious sites, but who automatically, because everything's so automated, their ads are showing up where they themselves would disagree to have their ads placed. So tweaking things like that, trying to make changes in the social media platforms, I think it's really great that Knight has decided to fund that. And then, I don't know that there's any substitution for public education and for civic innovation at local levels. And yes, this is an example of that, but we've also done quite a number of other things. For example, Hastings has designed curricula and teaching programs in bioethics. This summer we are launching a pilot workshop for high school science teachers, if you know any science teachers that would be interested to apply. We're actively seeking funding. We have funds to do this first inaugural one this summer, and we are looking for funding to make this be an annual thing. If you know anybody who wants to help support that, let me know. We're also designing a project that we hope will gain funding, which would involve developing community-based dialogues and case studies of the sorts of, almost taking the content from today, turning that into case studies that civic leaders at the community level could use to help bring this kind of thing to scale, but actually structure some case studies to facilitate that. So, as I say, if we're going to talk about public engagement, I think we have to talk about the quality of public education, and we have to think more creatively about civic innovations where people can talk about this among their neighbors. If a populace lacks education, it can still vote, as we know, but voting alone doesn't make a democracy. If we're really serious about a democratic way of life in the most robust meaning of that phrase, then we have to have educated citizens who are willing and able to reason together on the basis of evidence and willing to deliberate about their value differences in the public square in some way, ideally at a community level where we can listen to each other with more respect than we see at the national level. That's my only comment. We can open this up.